Now we're good.
You want to do your bit again, Fred?
Well, once again, welcome to you all and welcome to Monique Labat, who will show us 10 pictures and some talks about the Mauritius and the dodo, the old forgotten bird. It's not forgotten, I suppose, but
Yeah.
it's not among us anymore.
Yeah.
Monique, can I give you the word?
Before you hand it over to Monique, I have a little introduction, if I may.
Yeah, well, it's okay.
Thank you. So just to tell you a little bit about what this is all about, the International Fellowship of Birdwatching Rotarians is an international association of Rotary members who enjoy birding. The talk today is arranged by IFBR as part of their quarterly series of talks. Previous talks have been about birding in India, birding in Egypt, birding in Australia, and hawk migration in the United States. You can access videos of these talks. They're available online. Upcoming talks are on birding in Sweden and a birding trip to Sweden coordinated by IFBR member Eva Nordwell, who's online today. Among IFBR's other activities, during Rotary International's annual convention, we arrange a bird watching event at the location. The last one was in Melbourne, Australia, and the next one will be in Singapore in May 2024. In anticipation of the Singapore convention, we are working on one of these talks about birds in the March timeframe. So please look out for that. We hope that you will join us in these future talks. Today, IFBR member and Rotarian Monique Labat will be bringing us a talk about the now extinct dodo bird. Monique will trace the plight of this new now extinct bird. Monique will track the events that led to the extinction and lessons learned from the event. Monique Labat is a longtime Rotarian, having begun her Rotary journey as a member of the Rotary group study exchange to Turkey District 2420. Monique was a member of the Rotary Club of Durban in South Africa. Excuse me, Monique, I'm skipping over the name of the town there, which is part of a Rotary District 9370. She served in many leadership positions at the club and in the district. Monique is currently serving as the treasurer of the club in the Rotary E Club of South Africa 1, District 9370. Monique is also a member of Rotary International's Fellowship of Birdwatching Rotarians. With spouse Rotarian Francesco Petruccion, Monique relocated to Stellenbosch in Western Cape in 2022, and they immediately joined the Cape Bird Club. Excursions to Cape Town's Kirstenbosch National Botanical Garden in the foothills of Table Mountain and in Rui Els to view the Cape Rock Jumper have been highlights to date. In Mauritius, where Monique was born, she and Francesco have climbed Le Péton de la Rivière Noire, Le Monerin Mountain, and La Tourelle, visiting islands of Rodrigues, 574 kilometers to the east of Mauritius, to see the cave where Dodo of Rodrigues Island, called the Solitaire, lived, was a birding high point. Over to Monique. Enjoy her presentation. And folks, if you have questions, please type them in the chat session. We'll monitor that, or you may bring them up with your audio. Over to you, Monique.
Thank you very much, Krishna. Wherever you may be residing, I wish you good morning or good afternoon. Thank you for joining our International Fellowship of Birdwatching Rotarians online today. It gives me great pleasure to be presenting on a topic that is close to my heart, and I'm very grateful to the members of the Birdwatching Fellowship for this opportunity to share the talk about my birth island home of Mauritius, which was once home to the dodo. On our agenda today, we are going to situate the Mascarene Islands where the dodo lived, and we are going to move through history from the early sailors, the Arabs, the Portuguese, through to the Dutch colonization of Mauritius. We are going to think about what it means to have paradise lost and the importance of digging for clues. When was the first skeleton of the dodo discovered on Mauritius? We will find out. And which museums around the world hold real dodo skeleton material? And for those of you eager to visit this beautiful island in the Western Indian Ocean, there is a wonderful list of nature reserves, nature parks to visit. But most importantly, as human beings on this planet Earth, what can we do about conservation, and what lessons have we learned as a result of the extinction of the dodo? So Mauritius had the dodo, which is now the extinct flightless bird of Mauritius. And this dodo was one of 3 species that constituted the family Raffidae. And it was usually placed with pigeons in the order Columbiformes, but sometimes separated as an order altogether of Raffiformes. Across on Reunion Island to the west of Mauritius and the smaller island of Rodrigue to the east of Mauritius were birds which were called solitaires. And, sorry, I just want to cancel this quickly. There we go. So for a period of almost 200 years after its extinction, our dodo bird was forgotten, and there were some doubts as to whether it actually lived at all. It seemed that these strange birds had only been part of the imagination or exaggeration of sailors. And today, the once remote island of Mauritius is home to over 1.3 million inhabitants, made up of African, European, Chinese, and Indian origin. Conservation, we know, is critical to preserving the remaining fauna and flora of Mauritius, despite the accelerated pace of human encroachment and development on the island, which we know today. The west of Reunion Island is the large island of Madagascar, in itself a unique island biogeography. And to the west of Madagascar is the continent of Africa. In the early days, the records show us that the dodos were first seen and recorded by Portuguese sailors in approximately 1507. And it was believed that many years ago, the islands that form part of the Mascarene were actually joined together, and that they formed a submerged continent, which was called Lemuria. Now, the theory has lost its foundation because now the lemur, which is visible and very much alive on the island of Madagascar, is not evident on Mauritius at all. And Mauritius was uninhabited by man for many, many thousands of years. And the thought is that because the island was in the middle of the Indian Ocean, it was not on a major sea route, and that the ancient civilizations that went up and down the African coast would have hugged the coastline and would not have ventured further across into the middle of the Indian Ocean. It's only later when navigators such as Greek, Egyptian, Persian, Indian, and Chinese made their way along the coastlines that the sea routes were discovered. So the period 900 to 1000 AD, the Arabs were sailing up and down the African coast. They came as far south as Mozambique and the Comoros Islands. And they are the ones who started the Swahili culture And that word was derived from the word Sahel, S-A-H-E-L, which means coast. And they are the ones who named the Indian Ocean back then the Sea of Zanj. So it's interesting because now in Mauritius, a number of hotel groups have taken over the names which the Arabs had given to the islands. The Arabic name for the eastern island, which was Mauritius, was given the name Zina Arabi. And across on the west, which was Reunion Island, the Arabs gave it the name Zina Margabim. And for the first time, these names appeared on a Portuguese chart, and it was called the Cantino World Map, and that was created in 1502. So what was very interesting at this time is that it was very rare for the Portuguese to mark on a map land that they had not visited and explored. And it's likely that they showed interest in the Indian Ocean for religious reasons. They were anxious to convert the local populations to Christianity. And then they were also probably lured by making much profit as they could. They could attack the Arabs and take over the Arab trade that was plying up and down the east coast of Africa. So down here in the Cape where I live, we had a Portuguese explorer called Bartholomew Dias, who braved the stormy weather around the Cape of Good Hope. And he rounded the tip of this African continent, very much deep down in the south, in the southern Indian Ocean. And he goes down in history as being the first European to sail into the Indian Ocean. And this was now the way in which they opened up the sailing and exploration of the Indian Ocean and the sea route around the Cape of Good Hope. And the Portuguese went on to open strategic trade bases in India. And as a result of that, more and more records were being kept and found. And interestingly enough, in approximately 1598, the Dutch sailors found various wax tablets from a wreck that they imagined could have been from a Portuguese vessel. And on those wax tablets, a captain called Captain Fernandez named the island of Mauritius Isla do Cerne, or Swan's Island. And this was when he sailed from Mauritius onto India. So people or naturalists and botanists think that perhaps they speculate that there is a link between the birds that may have looked like swans that could have inspired the name Isla do Cerne, or Swan Island for Mauritius. And 6 years later, another Portuguese captain sailed into Mauritius and Reunion, and his name was Pero Mascarenhas. And he was the one who was deemed to have discovered Mauritius. However, Mascarenhas were not aware that several of his countrymen, other Portuguese sailors, had actually named the island Swan Island before him. And so he called this group of islands in the Indian Ocean islands the Mascarene Islands, which today we know as Reunion, which is a French island in the middle of the Indian Ocean, a French department, Mauritius, and to the east of Mauritius, the much smaller island of Rodrigue, where the solitaire bird lived. So for the Portuguese, there was very little interest, but what they did do is they introduced pigs, they introduced goats, they introduced chickens to feed the sailors. And this is important because it's one of the reasons for which the dodo's demise took place. So after the Portuguese had traveled through and past the Indian Ocean islands of Mauritius, along came the Dutch. And that was as late as 1598, when the Prince of Orange, his name was Maurits van Nassau, his name was given to Mauritius by the Dutch sailors that had arrived on the island. And they used it as a place in which to cut down the ebony trees, which they then exported from Mauritius. They were also responsible for bringing other animals, domestic animals such as cattle, poultry, as well as rabbits. And this placed a huge strain on the Mauritian wildlife, as you can imagine. And to add to that problem of the domesticated animals, black rats jumped from ships onto the island when the ships were moored close to the shore. And these black rats proved to be a large threat to the dodo eggs, as well as the young chicks that were walking about on the forest floor. So as the number of ships increased to Mauritius, these predators had an easy time because they found themselves on Mauritius and they were able to have a ready source of food. And sadly, the dodo, who had been on the island for what we believe is millions of years, were defenseless against these predators such as the rats and the domesticated animals. And even prior to the Dutch arriving, the Portuguese had brought with them a crab-eating macaque monkey. And this was the reason for them bringing the monkey to Mauritius was they wanted an additional source of food. And of course, with the introduction of the monkeys, this also led to the extinction of the dodo. And coupled with the monkeys that arrived on the island was also a large group of pigs that had been introduced to breed on the island. Many of these pigs broke out of their pens and were then in the forests of Mauritius. And on the forest floor where the dodos were laying their eggs and where they were rearing their young chicks, the pigs had an easy source of food. And this was one of the sad encroachments that the humans did as a result of developing the island of Mauritius as a refueling station on the way to the Western and Eastern Indian Ocean. So in the 1778 time of the history of Mauritius, it was very interesting because even though the Dutch remained on Mauritius until 1710, remember at the time of the arrival of the Portuguese and the Dutch, it seems the dodo had no fear of man. And during the 1778s, there was a particular secretary of a hospital who asked some old inhabitants of Mauritius, and that is in the late 1700s, had they had any knowledge of the existence of the dodo. And interestingly enough, at a banquet that was given by a British governor, not one of these elderly inhabitants, who were all in their 70s, had heard of the bird, the dodo, had no record of oral stories being shared by parents or grandparents. So what this means is that less than 100 years after the demise of the dodo, all traces of this bird had been wiped out by the island's collective memory, which is very sad. So in looking for clues to find the dodo in Mauritius, there was a British missionary, Mr. George Clark. He arrived in Mauritius in 1865, and he was the one to discover the bones of the dodo down in the southeast of the island. And this region was a marshy region. What George Clark had realized is that in this part of Mauritius, there were 3 rivers running into the sea, and they formed a muddy, marshy delta. And George believed that perhaps this could have been an area where the dodo may have lived. And so what he did, he recorded with some of his own students all the areas that he thought may bring up the discovery of the dodo bones. And interestingly enough, one day with a group of men who were wading through the marshy area, they were cutting away at the floating weeds in the marsh, in the deepest part of the marsh, and one of them rubbed up against a bone. And when he picked up the bone and showed it to missionary George Clark, George realized that this was the tibia, or could have been the tibia of the dodo bird. And this is very interesting because the bones that were discovered by George and his group of men that were excavating in this area, there were no cutting, no gnawing marks. These bones had never been burnt. So it was concluded that these dodos had been living here in the southeast region of Mauritius, and that they'd simply died a natural death. So Mauritius is prone to cyclones. And one of the theories could be that perhaps the dodos had taken refuge in this marshy area just before the cyclone hit. So perhaps this is one of the explanations that one could discuss as a result of the discovery of the bones that hadn't been gnawed on. There had been no cutting marks, and they'd certainly not been burnt if a human being had wanted to cook the bird over a fire in the outdoors. So this marshy area that you see on the left of the screen comprises an area of about 4 to 5 acres, and it's only half a kilometer away from the ocean, and it was separated from the ocean by some low sand hills as well as basaltic rock, for which Mauritius is known. The region here was originally a ravine, and it was drained from a much larger marshy area of almost 200 acres. And over the course of the ages, this ravine was covered in luxuriant growth, lots of ferns and sedges that had spread all over the marshy area. And this was compacted and the perfect state of preservation for the dodo bones, which had been found by George Clark in 1865. And what George did is once he discovered the bones and had cleaned them and prepared them, with the help of ornithologists, these bones, along with the Mauritius Institute, were sent to numerous museums around the world. And these skeletons were put in place. Many of the bones had to be, of course, detailed, itemized. And what's very interesting is to look back from that period of 158 years ago when those dodo birds were found, because at the time, there was very little evidence that seemed to prove that the dodo ever existed. And there were only some eyewitness accounts from sailors that had visited Mauritius in the 1600s. There were a few paintings, and there were possibly some bones in some of the European museums, but very little else. And if you travel to the south of Mauritius, not far from the marshy area, the dodo bones that were discovered by George Clark, there's an excellent coincidence because the author Lewis Carroll, who wrote Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, this is the book that launched the dodo into world fame. And a large proportion of the dodo bones held in museums and institutions around the world came from George Clark's excavations in this marshy area in the southeast of Mauritius. And George Clark was not the only explorer and discoverer of dodo bones. A few years later, a French barber by the name of Louis Thiriou arrived in Mauritius. And Louis' fascination was to explore caves, to explore rivers, and to explore holes. And then he recorded these findings with great patience and diligence. And he especially enjoyed chatting to his hairdressing clients about his discoveries. And the bones that Louis found were very close to the 3 suburbs of Port Louis. The one is around the mountain called Le Pouce, which is the thumb in French. The other 2 suburbs were called Anse Courtois and the Valley of the Priest, La Vallée des Prêtres. And the importance of Louis' discovery of his dodo bones is that in one instance, he discovered almost the entire skeleton from a single dodo. Now, I presume that archaeologists and others who spend their life excavating and discovering pieces of bone, shell middens around the world. It's important that if you can complete a skeleton, you have a much clearer idea of what the finished bird or animal may be, because if you don't have an eyewitness account, if you don't have detailed records, it's really from these skeletons that one can imagine what the dodo bird could have been like. And at the outset, Louis was very happy with this discovery, and he donated the bones to various museums around the world as well. And on the island of Mauritius, in the capital city of Port Louis, you've got a natural history museum. And here you've got 2 skeletons of the dodo, which came from the bones discovered in the marsh, as well as various paintings of the dodo. In Mauritius, not far from the Natural History Museum, the Mauritius Commercial Bank created a blue penny museum. And this is on the waterfront of Port Louis. The blue penny, for those of you who have an interest in philately, will know that these are extremely rare, unfranked stamps that have an unlimited value because there were so few that were printed at the time. And in the Blue Penny Museum is a showcase of Mauritian exhibits as well. And that museum has a beautiful curated exhibition on at the moment, and which describes the various weeds and spinach types of Mauritius grown throughout the ages, which people from India, the indentured laborers that were shipped to Mauritius from 1860, brought with them as well as the local indigenous spinach types as well. And then the site of the Dutch colony in Mauritius is in the southeast of the island, where the airport is located. And there you have the Naval Museum in the town of Maibour. And that museum is also worthwhile to visit and to see the various artifacts and exhibits surrounding the dodo. So around the world, we have 27 museums that hold various parts and real dodo skeletons. And these stretch from Austria, Belgium, the Czech Republic, Denmark and England, France and Germany, the Netherlands, Ireland, Japan, the Isle of Jersey, because of the Gerald Durrell Wildlife Foundation, Scotland, Wales, as well as the United States, where some of you are located. And fortunately for us in South Africa, we have two museums, one in Durban, the city on the east coast of KwaZulu-Natal, where Francesco and I used to live, as well as the South African Museum in Cape Town that have dodo exhibits. In Mauritius, although a lot of the island has been developed particularly for tourism purposes, to create jobs for the local population, as well as there was a period of clothing and textile factories, there are still a number of nature parks and reserves to visit. And some of these include the Black River Gorges, and there they have many areas of endemic forest that still exist. On the west coast, Kazla Nature and Leisure Park is very educational, and this is particularly important if one wants to pass on to the young people of this world the importance of conservation. To the west, northwest, is the Col de Garde Nature Reserve. And here you have a particular endemic tree called the Trochetia and Parviflora. And this tree was considered extinct for almost a whole century. And then, as late as 2001, one specimen of the tree was discovered in this nature reserve. So that's a very important park in which to preserve the importance of not just the fauna, but also the flora of Mauritius. Mauritius has two botanical gardens, the one in the center of the island called Kuurpiep, and there you can see various endemic as well as indigenous plants. And then the more famous one, named after the first Prime Minister of Mauritius, Sir Siusaga Ramgoolam. Mauritius became a republic independent of Britain on the 12th of March, 1968. And the botanic gardens named after the first Prime Minister are just beautiful. This is where you will also find the large Victoriana water lily, on which a young child, it's said, can walk on the water lily because the water lily is so strong. And it has a range of both endemic as well as exotic flora in the Pamplemousse Gardens to the north of Mauritius. The Ebony Forest Reserve, as the name suggests, is a paradise for the last endemic flora and fauna. And this is a high quality forest situated with a lot of native trees, and 50 hectares have been restored, of which 16 hectares have had all its invasive species removed. We've got two invasive species in Mauritius, the Chinese guava, Goyave de Chine, as well as the privet. And these have a stranglehold on the endemic flora of Mauritius. So in conjunction with the government of Mauritius, as well as the very important Mauritian Wildlife Foundation, it's very important that all the invasive species be removed as much as possible. And this is the area where the endangered pink pigeon, the echo parakeet were also reintroduced, and the national bird of Mauritius, the Mauritius kestrel, was down to 4 specimens left in the wild. And thanks to the efforts of the Gerald Durrell Wildlife Sanctuary and Professor Carl Jones from Wales, they were able to ensure that the Mauritius kestrel and other near threatened and critically endangered endemic birds of Mauritius are slowly flourishing, but one must still ensure that we preserve the forest ranges of these endemic trees of Mauritius, because without that, we know that the birds, just like the demise of the dodo, will not be able to survive without their natural habitat. On the southeast coast, not far from the marshy area where George Clark discovered first the bones of the dodo, is Île aux Aigrettes, or Egret Island. This little island is inside the lagoon, and one can take a small boat across, and this is where the Mauritian Wildlife Foundation is hard at work. The ebony trees have been replanted on Egret Island, and here birds such as the pink pigeon, the large Aldabra tortoises that are originally from the Seychelles can be seen, along with other endemic fauna such as the Telfair's skink, a small-looking lizard that is now has got its home on Egret Island in the southeast. And down in the south of Mauritius, one can also visit the Vanilla Reserve, which is also has a small museum and dodo experience. The mountain that the French barber discovered the bones, Louis Thiriou, was close to the mountain called Le Pouce, the thumb. And here there is a nature reserve now, and this nature reserve is another park which preserves the importance of the fauna and flora of Mauritius. And lastly, the Mauritius has 2 extinct volcanic craters on the island. The first one is the Trouosef, the Stag Hole, which is in the center of the island, and the second one is in the south of Mauritius, and it's called Bassin Blanc, or White Lake. And these were the site of the 2 volcanic eruptions that created the island of Mauritius. And there as well, you've got endemic forests that surround the volcanic craters, and one can visit these volcanic craters, which are filled with water, and you can get an understanding of what Mauritius could have been like during the time of the dodo. So perhaps I'll just go back to here first. For conservation purposes, it's very interesting that the African Bird Club, which is a charity registered in England and Wales, is based in Cambridge in the United Kingdom, and they fund various conservation projects across the continent of Africa as well as the related islands. They have grant programs, and what I found of great interest, particularly for conservation in Africa and the Indian Ocean Islands, is that as recently as 2021, which is 2 years ago, the African Bird Club paid over a grant of 3,000 British pounds, and a report was done because of the effects of COVID. And the report that the students researched was called, "Where Have All the Birds Gone?" And this was a multi-species approach to confirm the distribution of threatened Mauritian birds in a particular region of Mauritius, in the Bamboo Mountains. And this was as a result of the aftermath of COVID. So even up until now, one can never sit on one's laurels and expect that these bird species, animal species are going to survive. So right up until as recently as 2 years ago, research was being done because it was discovered that even though in some countries around the world at the start of COVID, many animal species were seen wandering in city streets, we had evidence of that on news broadcasts as well as on social media. But here in Mauritius, thanks to the African Bird Club in Cambridge, research was being done to discover where were the birds post-COVID. And there are a number of interesting birding magazines that I will share on a separate page with anybody who is interested. And we in South Africa also have the African BirdLife magazine, and it's a publication by BirdLife South Africa. They have offices in Cape Town and Johannesburg. And interestingly enough, the issue September-October 2023 had a conservation article by none other than Professor Peter Ryan, and it was talking of common birds in decline in South Africa. So one can never be too optimistic. Conservation must be an ongoing strategy so that we can maintain the bird life that we've enjoyed in our lifetime, so that our children and grandchildren can also enjoy the fauna and flora of the regions around the world. And in this one-pager that I've created, I've also given a summary of interesting websites. There's a free birding app which the African Bird Club created for the birds of Mauritius. So you can download it from the App Store or from Google Play, and it gives you all the bird species of the Indian Ocean islands of Mauritius as well as Rodrigue. And one of the largest non-governmental foundations in Mauritius, the Mauritian Wildlife Foundation, is supporting this bird life outreach. And it's very important because they have funds where they also assist young students from around the world who come to Mauritius and do research stints in the various nature reserves, the parks of Mauritius. And this is to be encouraged not only for sharing of valuable information, but also for the young people of Mauritius themselves to value what they have on their island. So there are a number of books that I consulted prior to putting this presentation together. But before we even touch on that bibliography, if we think about the dinosaurs being wiped out over 70 million years ago, that must have been probably one of the most dramatic extinctions that we think of as human beings. And yet it's the dodo that is the symbol of extinction mostly. And through its depiction, the dodo is a harmless, friendly victim of man's indifference. And this poor dodo has become the emblematic figure for numerous environmental protection programs as well as organizations. And these are the organizations around the world which support the plight of endangered animals. And of course, children are very receptive as an audience. And one effective way I found to educate adults about the social and environmental issues is by spreading vital information through child-oriented media. And the children, in turn, will spread the word to their elders. So for a very long time, the destructive actions of man went unheeded, and it took over 200 years for the dodo to become noticed by its absence. And some disputed claims accuse the Dutch sailors of eating the dodo to extinction. But the irony is that the fated bird actually did not taste nice. So perhaps we must ask ourselves, had the dodo been more palatable, it would probably have been domesticated and preserved to this day. So in summary, the lessons we've learned from the demise of the dodo became the catalyst for the beginning of a worldwide preservation and conservation order. And there is now a determination to honor our environmental responsibilities. Even Rotary, in its areas of focus, recently added a 7th area of focus, which is the environment. And Rotary keeps up to date with developments around the world, is cognizant of the fact that without the environment, life on planet Earth will not be fun. But our battle is not yet won. In the book, The Song of the Dodo, subtitled Island Biogeography in an Age of Extinction, this book was written by David Quammen in 1996. David sets the scene for the final agony and loneliness of the last dodo in Mauritius. In the dark of an early morning, say during a rainstorm, she took cover beneath a cold stone ledge at the base of one of the Black River Gorge cliffs. She drew her head down against her body. She fluffed her feathers for warmth, squinted in patient misery. She waited. She didn't know it, nor did anyone else, but she was the last dodo on Earth. When the storm passed, she never opened her eyes. This is extinction. So our dodo bird, Raphis cuculatus, is no more, but the tragedy of its extinction must ensure that other species will not go the way of the dodo. My sincere thanks to the International Fellowship of Birdwatching Rotarians for the opportunity to share a little about my birth island, Mauritius's extinct bird, the dodo, with you today. And please, if there are any comments or questions, I'll do my best.
Thank you, Monique, for that wonderful talk and very sobering talk. We're open for questions at this moment. Either you may type it in the chat session or unmute yourself and ask the question. Barring none, I'll start.
I actually have a question. Monique.
Please go ahead.
Monique, this is Judy again. I'm in Seattle, Washington. I noticed in looking at the pictures that there were a number of different ways that the bird was actually presented in different colors and feather types and so on. Do you know anything at all about that?
Yes, there were some artists' impressions, Judy. So a number of the publications that I consulted, it depended sometimes on memory, sometimes on records that were kept in sailors' logs. And so many of the museums that received the dodo skeletons reconstructed the various dodos and covered some of the skeletons, like the one in the Natural History Museum of Durban is more on the gray going to the white color of feathers. So it really depended on history and what was happening at the time.
Thank you.
But if you go back to the list of publications that I have in the bibliography, and I believe that, Krishna, you're going to share the presentation, you will see, like you say, Judy, many different versions of the dodo. In its skeleton form, that was obvious, but when people were designing the bird or drawing the bird from memory, it was very different.
Thank you.
Alison Tucker, I think you have your hand up for a question. Please go ahead.
Yes, I do. Hello, Monique, and thank you so much for that lovely presentation. While you've been talking, myself and Jenny Casey, both from East London here in South Africa, have been Googling excitedly about the dodo to discover that there's what is thought to be a dodo egg at the East London Museum, which is our town of birth. Monique, are you aware of any other eggs, dodo eggs, that or claimed to be dodo eggs anywhere around the world?
Not the eggs, Ali, but you'll know that the very famous Marjorie Latimer, who was the lady who discovered the coelacanth and who pointed it out to Professor J.L.B. Smith and Professor Margaret Smith of the ichthyology department at Rhodes University, where you studied. She was the one who has commented regarding the egg, which they assumed was a dodo egg. However, at this stage, one would need to understand where it was discovered, a bit more background about it, but I did read that as part of my research. So I think that could be an entire talk on its own going forward.
Thank you. I will go and visit while I'm there next week. I'll go to the East London Museum, a good excuse to get there. Thank you.
And please, would you share whatever you discover in East London with us?
We will do.
Yeah, again, another pitch for IFBR. Alison, if you're not a member, please consider becoming a member. And we have a reasonably active Facebook presence. So anything that you have in the form of pictures, you could share it there with all the members of this club. Thank you. I have a question based on Judy's. Do you know if there was any difference between plumage and size between the two genders?
There was actually very little difference between the female and the male dodo. What is interesting is to the east of Mauritius, the small island of Rodrigue, Krishna, there was a bird that looked much more like a large goose. And that bird, I make reference to it in slide number 3, was called the solitaire. And the solitaire was also discovered across on Reunion Island. So what is interesting is that at the time when one didn't have iPhones and very fancy cameras to record what one was seeing back in the 1500s, the 1600s, one had to rely on drafting skills, on drawing skills, and the solitaires in Rodrigue Island, their entire skeletons were discovered in a series of caves, and you can visit the Francois Legat nature reserve on Rodrigue to actually see this bird. There was some confusion regarding because of the name of the island of the Swan for Mauritius as well, where some of the sailors may have thought that the solitaire bird, which was a much taller necked bird compared to the dodo that had a very short squat neck but a very large beak, were a completely different bird, which has been found to be. So the dodo female and the dodo male birds were much of a muchness. And we have a photograph of them on the slide right at the beginning of the presentation, which the Britannica actually puts next to a standard rule to show you the size of the bird, and both male and female were much of a muchness.
Thank you.
Hello, Monique. Hi, Sonia. I'm coming to you from Reston, Virginia. I wanted to ask about the just generally as we think about conservation and the dynamic of the dodo in terms of it being discovered on the island, and then how that would or wouldn't translate to species that we've lost knowledge of, let's say in the Amazon or, you know, a place like that. Do you have a sense or maybe a resource that we could go to learn about some of these other extinct species and what their stories might be? Because I think this one was a really interesting story, and I wonder if there's a place we can go to learn about other stories.
Sonia, thank you very much for that very interesting comment and question. I don't personally have either a website or an organization for you, but I'm going to open this up to the other bird watching Rotarians on the group in case they may know of something.
Monique, I don't have, or Sonia, I don't have any specific resources to direct you to, but I do know that here in the US, the island of Hawaii, or the Hawaiian Islands, have many birds that are either on the edge of extinction or have become extinct. So I would think if you searched for that, you might find some good references. And I can only talk about birds. I can't go beyond that. And then the other place that I'm familiar with that has some of the same issues as Monique talked about on Mauritius is New Zealand. They had many birds there that are ground-dwelling birds, as the dodo was, and they had, there's actually an island there called Tiri Tiri Matanga, I believe is the way you say it, where they have, it's an island right off the coast of New Zealand as part of it, and they have done a lot to remove, it was turned into farmland, and they've done a lot to remove all of that, as well as the rats and the cats and everything else that were there, in an effort to save some of the birds that were dramatically endangered. And I think they've had some, like some of the kiwis and things like that, and I think they've had they have had success in that, but at the same time there were other birds, other species that have become extinct. So again, no specific reference, but two areas that I think you could find more about birds and these issues that Monique's been talking about.
Thank you, Julie. It's interesting because 6 years ago, we visited Tiri Tiri Matangi, which is off the east coast of Auckland, North Island. And I've just had a thought. Right here in Cape Town is the Percy Fitzpatrick Ornithology Department at the University of Cape Town, Sonia. So what I'll do is I'll write to Professor Peter Ryan, as well as to the CEO of our BirdLife South Africa, because just like these important islands that are either taken over by domesticated animals or exotic plant life, there is a big drive. South of Cape Town is Marion Island and Prince Edward Island. And we are, as members of the Cape Bird Club, members of BirdLife South Africa, a lot of emphasis is being placed because albatross chicks are being eaten by, again, feral rats on the island. So for every acre that one can remove the rats, the mice, etc., the greater the opportunity that the albatross species, of which there are many, will survive. So what I'll do is I'll write to these two birding sources, because I'm just a passionate, enthusiastic birder. I don't have any a background. So let me write to them and ask if there are various sites that would provide us with more information regarding extinction of species on the planet.
Yeah, along those lines, a thought just came up. Here in the United States, especially on the East Coast, I'm aware of a effort to eradicate rats. But apparently, the chemical that's used to eradicate the rats also makes the birds that eat them sterile. So there is a backlash on how you approach these environmental things, and a lot more thought needs to be put into, how you approach these things. Just as a caution, this is something that's happening here.
True. Yeah.
Monique, you talked about 3 different islands in the little write-up that mountains that in Mauritius, in your little write-up that you sent to me before. I did not hear you mention those. Could you shed some light on what those 3 mountains are and why you called them out in your bio?
So on the slide that you see here is a big square mountain surrounded by a lagoon with a coral reef. This square mountain is in the southwest of Mauritius, and it's called Le Morne. And this was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site, Krishna. And the reason being that when slavery was abolished by Britain on Mauritius, there were some slaves that were found living in this mountainous forested area. And sadly, when the various police were asked to advise the slaves that they were now freed, the slaves felt that they were going to be recaptured once again. And so instead of being recaptured, they preferred to jump to their deaths off this mountain. So this mountain holds huge significance for the abolition of slavery in Mauritius. And to this day, in early November, we have a public holiday that honors this very dark period in the history of our small island of Mauritius. And on a more cheerful note, you can climb the mountain, which Francesco and I have done, and you can climb up to 550 meters high, which is up to a large metal cross. And the views from the top are just incredible. And you need to take a guide with you, and it's very worthwhile because the guide can give you the history, the geography of the mountain, and points out various parts of the island that you can see from the top. The 2 other mountains, one is called La Tourelle du Tamarin, and tamarind is a tree which originates in India, and we've got it growing all over Mauritius. We use it extensively in our Mauritian cuisine, and that is a more conical mountain just to the left of the Le Morne mountain, and that one, try and climb it in mid-year, in the middle winter months, because if you climb it in the summer months, it's terribly, terribly hot. Or you leave very early in the morning if you want to make it all the way to the top. The third is the Black River Gorges, where the vast majority of Mauritius's endemic forest exists. Also located, you can actually see it across at the back end of the slide that I have here. And that is also Probably it is the largest area of nature park in Mauritius that is preserved. And there again, a lot of the invasive species such as the Chinese guava and the privet have been removed from the Black River gorges.
Thank you. I think Peter has his hands up. Go ahead, Peter. Unmute yourself and ask the question.
Yes, thank you very much. Monique, I'm speaking from Amsterdam, the Netherlands. And first of all, I want to thank you for this very interesting talk. Little did I know about the island of Mauritius. I even didn't know it was named after a Dutch prince, Maurits. So you gave us a lot in this hour. And there's one interesting thing that struck me, and that we don't know much about Mauritius. We know more now, of course, but we all know the dodo. That is a strange mystery around the bird. Well, we have all heard about the dodo, at least I think. And I think it has a little bit to do with the name. The name dodo is the same, it's easy, and it's the same in all languages, as far as I know, in the world. We in Holland, we call it a dodo. But do you know, where does this sound or name dodo come from?
Aha, if you give me half a second, I did write it down. Here we go. So it came from the Dutch. And here we go. So it was, here we go. The south east bay of Mauritius, where the Dutch landed for the first time, they called it Warwick Bay. And here they found a place with great quantity of fowls, twice as big as swans. And here you have the reference, Peter, to the solitaire that was seen on Rodrigues Reunion, as well as the dodo, the swan. And they were called wallow birds or valgestocks, which apparently in Dutch means loathsome birds. And so from that, they deduced, according to this, that the word dodo was referred to as tottersten or valg birds, and which also meant apparently slow, stupid, and this is the reference in one of the many books that I've read. Does that give you a little bit of insight?
Yes. Well, still, I still think it's a very nice sound. It's an easy sound, so it's much easier to remember than, for instance, well, many other bird names are. But in Holland, well, the sound dodo is familiar, but it doesn't ring a bell on other words to me. In Dutch, we call a dodo also a loopvogel, which means a bird that can walk, and that's of course what it is, because it couldn't fly. It walked, and it's quite big, of course. But thank you very much again.
Thank you.
Yeah, here in the United States, I know that it's not very flattering to be called a dodo bird, but that's unfortunate. So any other questions? But before we go on, there are a lot of folks online. In the past, we've had people introduce themselves. Would you please kindly, in the view of time, enter your name, your location, and if you want to be contacted, an email address into the chat session, please. So if you are interested in IFBR, the fellowship, or if you want to be contacted, could you please type your name and your email address into the chat session? Okay, any other questions? Okay, one last thought then. I believe that the Mauritius island has an even more bigger existential threat at this moment. The politicians on Mauritius Islands are calling attention to the fact that the environmental issues resulting in the raise of the sea levels are going to be threatening the existence of the island itself. Do you know anything about those kind of issues, Monique?
Krishna, I know that many of the islands of the Indian Ocean, in particular the Maldives, their government is always appealing to reduce the CO2 and rather use renewable energies where possible because of the rise in global temperatures that are affecting them. And in Mauritius, I'm sure it'll be the same thing, along with many of the other islands around the world.
Okay. Thank you.
Krishna, or maybe Eva, I think we have a potential date for our next webinar. Could we share that?
I don't have it handy. Eva, do you? I think we agreed on a date for this talk by your friend from Sweden. Are you there, Eva? Are you able to?
Yeah, she's talking, but we can't hear.
Yeah.
She said 1 second, if I'm reading lips correctly.
Yeah. Still
Could you
no.
put it in the chat, maybe?
Okay. While we wait for her to enter that date, please include your email address if you're not already a member, or if you don't know you, or as a matter of fact, anybody that wants to do that, kindly enter your email address so that way we can contact you. We have a few interesting talks coming up, and there are other events that IFBR plans, especially around the Rotary International Convention. So if you want to stay abreast of all of those, it'd be nice if you can share your email address.
I just checked the chat, and Eva said that the next webinar is the last Saturday in January, which would be the 27th. And it's about, it's Magnus Hellstrom. Sorry about if I didn't do that right. I'm going to talk about the birds in south of Sweden. And for IFBR members, we do have an upcoming trip that Eva has helped plan to Sweden in September, I think. And so that might be another good reason to join IFBR if you're considering it. Thanks, Eva.
Okay. Any more questions? Any more thoughts? Any last comments from you, Monique?
Thank you, Krishna. I'll share the one-pager with the list of links and websites, and I'll also revert further to Sonia's comment regarding extinction as soon as I hear from the birding authorities here in South Africa.
That's good. Sounds good.
Thank you again.
Any comments about how you can visit Mauritius? How do you get there?
So I have another one-pager, which I call 7 Days in Mauritius, with lots of links of where to go, what to do. And Alison, my friend, was there last month and was able to enjoy some of the sights of the island. So there are birding guides, as well as the list of nature reserves that one can visit. And Mauritius is served by most of the major airlines, for example, Emirates, British Airways, from Europe and the Middle East. I'm not 100% sure about from the USA, where many of you are based, but I'm sure we could find out, because you could then take a connection either through Dubai or London or one of those.
Thank you. All right, then. Thank you very much, Monique. It was very interesting to listen to you. You did a wonderful job and a very in-depth presentation. It looks like you put a lot of effort into it. We appreciate that.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Monique. It was great.
Thank you, Monique. Go ahead and put that other page up with the websites, though, if you could. Thanks. So we have a recording of it.
Monique, he was talking about putting it up right now if you have access to it. So
that won't be that easy. It's sitting in one of my other folders. Sorry.
Oh, I see. I see.
But I'll happily
right.
share it. Yeah.
Thank you.
We have your email. Thanks.
Yes. Thank you very much indeed.
Excellent. Thank you.
thank you all.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Bye now.